Hey everyone, today I wanted to talk about resawing lumber and why that's an essential skill that you need to learn in your shop. So let's take a look. So having the ability to take a board like this, that's essentially 2 inches thick, it started as a 12-foot long board, and turn it into lumber that's usable, more manageable, small little pieces, something like that, takes quite the process, but it's something that everyone can do with a little bit of setup, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Starting with prepped lumber is the next step in the process to resaw a board. So what does that mean? We're going to flatten a face, we're going to put a square edge on that board, and we're going to do that with the joiner. This is critical because it creates a reference face for our fence when we go to the bandsaw to actually make the resawn cuts. The next step, as an optional step, would be taking the opposite side of the side we jointed and ripping that off so that you have 4 square sides. All right, so we've made it to the next step in the process, the bandsaw. First thing we got to do is decide what our layout is going to be, how many pieces we want to get out of the board. All of those things make a factor when you are setting up your bandsaw. So let's take a look. Depending on how critical you want to be, you can do something as simple as a consecutive pencil lines that just give you an idea of how many pieces you can get out of the board, or you can actually cut a piece, take that rough sawn face back to the joiner, clean that face off, come back to the bandsaw, cut a piece again, do that process, and you're going to have a clean board on both sides that is whatever thickness you chose. For this particular cut, I am just going to cut pencil lines and show you that you can repeat, and if the cut is clean enough, you can just continue to proceed with the bandsaw without joining in between as a rough sawn board, now thickness to closer to what your final dimension needs to be. All right, next step at the bandsaw is to adjust the height of your guides. If I was going to resaw this board with the blade exposed this much, what's the problem? Well, there's a lot of flex in that blade. So I want to eliminate that as much as possible by adjusting this guide down to match the thickness or the height of my board. So I like to leave 3/4 of an inch to an inch above the board just to give it plenty of room. Once that's been set, we'll take the fence and we will adjust to our thickness that we're wanting. As you can see here, my fence is hitting the guides, so I'm going to remove that portion. Lock my fence, and that portion is ready to go. On this particular board, we have such a short length that I could apply pressure against the fence and push the board through the blade, continuing that pressure until this piece comes out and I get my resawn board. The most appropriate action would be taking some form of a feather board, adjusting it into place so that there's consistent pressure on the board as I push through the blade. After that cut was completed, if you take this board, you can open it up, and there you have it, a resawn board, slightly over an 1/8 inch thick. I have a smooth face on one side, a bandsaw face on the other, as you can tell on some of the texture, and I will run that through a sander to my final thickness for a thick veneer. So now you have the option. You can continue to cut up the board with that setup and just run every cut. That would produce a bandsaw face on both sides of the board. It's a little less accurate. Or I could take this rough face, take it to the joiner again, like I said, and start again with a fresh face on every cut. So that choice is up to you. Another option that you have, instead of just setting the fence and running with featherboard pressure against the blade, is to run a pencil line down the edge of your board that you can sight when you're cutting and push the blade through manually and complete the cut. Why would I want to do that? Sometimes I just want to break down a 2-inch thick board into 1-inch boards. So I simply set a square to 1 inch, in this case about 1/2 inch. Set my fence on the board and draw a pencil line from one end to the other. Just putting the pencil up against the fence square and running that line down. That completes an even and straight line across the board the entire length. One of the best parts about resawing the boards is you can take a board like we started with, turning it into multiple pieces of wood, usable material that you can then veneer or just simply build from if you cut it to the appropriate thickness. So pretty cool. All of that is usable material. Being able to take a single board and turn it into these strips is very beneficial in the shop. One application would be using bent laminations. So let's say I wanted to build a curve and I couldn't make that curve. So what do? You resaw the board into multiple thin strips, getting everything smoothed out, getting it glued together and bent around to form, and this board at this thickness will bend a lot easier than that 2-inch thick board that we started with. A very practical application of cutting boards into 1/8-inch strips would be in the Maloof rocking chair build, or anything really that you need a complex curve on. So in this example, what I have here is the curved rocker base. This is all bent lamination. It hasn't been shaped yet, but it shows that if you build a form with glue between the strips, it will hold into whatever shape you create. The other advantage is you get to do things like this, adding a separate species in between the lamination stack. So let's take a look a little bit closer. All right, same chair. We have the back slat, and you can see the complex curve for the lumbar support that comes in this board. It's made out of 4 pieces of 1/8-inch material. When I look at that closely, you can see the stack. All of that is glued together into that curve, and it allows me to create a pretty fun, unique piece of wood that features curly maple on the front and walnut on the back, And you can't get that naturally. So obviously the way to do it is cut strips and do a bent lamination. There you have it. The basics of taking big boards and making them smaller, a little bit at a time. Resawing is actually one of my favorite things to do. I utilize lumber in different ways because I simply cut it down to smaller, more manageable pieces. You can do that. You can do that with extremely figured woods to save the material, to use it, stretch it. That's one way that I do it in the shop. I hope you enjoyed the process. I hope it gave you a little bit of insight on what it takes to resaw. It doesn't have to be super precise as long as you give yourself room to work with that material. In the end, it's up to you just getting in the shop, making some cuts, learning the process, and keeping at it until you get better and better every day. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for following along. We'll see you next time.